Hello and welcome to the Rain Check Podcast, episode
Woohoo!
6 about King Eadred
And his mom, the
and his
infamous
mom.
Edgifu.
Speaking of moms, this is
Hmm.
my mom Donna,
Hello.
and I'm Austin. As always, we are talking about the life of all of the monarchs of England.
Well,
So,
starting with Alfred the Great.
starting with Alfred the Great. And what's funny is that we have done, as you know, 6 episodes, and we are still on the grandson of Alfred the
Correct.
Great.
Yep, he's got a lot of them.
So we are still on a son of Edward the Elder, his youngest son, Eadred. So he was the son of Edward's third wife, Edgifu, and he is the younger brother of the previous king, Edmund, who, as we know, was basically stabbed, was killed by a criminal, a thief, who had kidnapped his steward.
I'm sure that Eadred didn't expect, like you were saying, to take over right then. And it's interesting because Edmund had two sons. So one would think, using what we know mostly of English history, that the crown would go to the son, even if the son was an infant, which happens later on in the course of the English history. But in this case, his sons were young. And of the previous 8 Wessex successions, 5 of them were from a brother to a brother, and only
Right.
3 from a king to his son. So I think it wasn't that unusual then, because there was a time of war, and it's got to be a lot easier to have someone that's old enough to fight on the throne rather than a young son. So
Definitely. I was actually thinking about the same thing this week since we've had so many of these brothers. And I don't know if it's because of the fact that they were all brothers rather than sons. It's sort of a different dynamic, but it just feels like the succession has been pretty easygoing. It's been pretty peaceful compared to, like the War of the Roses or later times in English history where the succession can cause like a huge crisis. It feels like for whatever reason, this family is really sticking together and they're keeping the same cabinet or whatever you would call it together. And really the main conflicts are about retaking or conquering land from Vikings rather than fighting like civil wars.
okay, I'm going to give potential credit
Mm-hmm.
to Ed Gifu.
Okay.
As we know in a previous episode, it's possible that the reason the reign went to Athelstan was in part because Ed Gifu brokered a deal with Athelstan that he make her son Edmund his heir, and therefore that succession went pretty smoothly because it had been agreed upon. And it's possible that Ed Gifu also said to her son Edmund, "Hey, until your sons get older, at least you should make." Well, I don't know if Edmund had designated Edred as his heir, or if it was something that the Witan decided, and maybe Ed Gifu negotiated with the Witan about it.
Right, but I think either way, like Ed Gifu is clearly a really powerful voice in the government, and I'm sure the Witan or like chose Eadred, but it was strongly influenced by the fact that Ed Gifu was his mom.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's get into the life of Eadred. So he was born in the year 923. And one thing I feel like for Eadred is he really is like the youngest of the youngest brother. So he's kind of grown up around all these kings and then, multiple kings basically he's grown up with.
Yeah, because he grew up in Athelstan's court as well with Edmund, right?
Yeah. So, just like Edmund, they grew up in court, but I just feel like, especially for Eadred, since he was the youngest, he really got to see a lot of older kings that he could then base his own rule off of. He was prepared, right? Like a lot of kings, it's like, oh, they start being king kind of out of nowhere and they're surprised by it. But in this case, it feels
Mhm.
like he would have been somewhat ready, or at least was around a lot of people who were king. And there's another important person that's going to come up during Eadred's life that was actually chosen to join the court by the earlier king, King Edmund from last week. So I think we mentioned this last week, but King Edmund appoints this guy Dunstan as abbot of Glastonbury, and it basically is the beginning of that abbey becoming one of England's greatest centers of learning. And they also had manuscript production, and as we said, it's the Benedictine monastic reform. So they start becoming really strongly Benedictine, and this Dunstan character is a big reason for that.
Yeah, I will just interject that before this time, the monasteries had become a little bit like frat houses for rich
Oh,
kids.
perhaps that.
There weren't a lot of restrictions, or what restrictions there were weren't really being followed. So if you had a bunch of sons, your eldest maybe was going to inherit the land, and so you wanted something to do with your younger sons, which still could have a powerful position. So you'd send them off to be a bishop or an abbot, and you send them to these monasteries, but they could still be married. Basically, from what I was reading, we're having a grand old time, having parties and just enjoying things, and not a lot of attention paid to the Bible. And
I don't really see.
Dunstan,
This sounds great. I don't really get why they had to change it. This
I
sounds much
know.
better than what it's going to become.
So Dunstan gets some bad press also from some people because the kids started complaining to their parents, like, what the hell's going on? I had it good here, and now all of a sudden I can't be married. I'm not supposed to have any sex. I can't. Apparently, they couldn't eat meat.
Hmm.
Yeah, so they had to give up their their worldly possessions, sex, and meat.
Yeah, Dunstan really sounds like a bit of a dour, kind of Debbie Downer type guy.
Yes.
I read that he lived as a hermit in Glastonbury, where he built a tiny cell barely large enough to lie down in and spent hours in prayer and metalwork. And I feel like it's easy to see that as a really great, honorable thing to do. And wow, like he had such little need for earthly possessions, and he just wanted to, all he needed was this tiny cell and to pray, but which is great. But at the same time, it's a bit like, I feel like you can be so humble that you're almost egotistical. You're like,
Exactly. You get your pride from this show of what you're doing without. I don't know,
walking through
like
the street like whipping yourself like I'm such
right.
a bad
I think,
person.
I don't think it's good at all, really, because I grew up in a pretty strict religious, not near that strict, but it's like almost you hear about the bad things. Like, here's all the things you don't want to do because you don't want to go burn in hell for eternity, And
Right.
all this negativity and this punishing yourself and berating yourself for all your sins. But what about joy? What about enjoying this life that God's given you? What
Hmm.
about it? Just feels like it's a mistake to focus on the deprivation, and like you have to be like by yourself praying all the time instead of being out and celebrating with people and helping people and being in community with people. So I don't know. I'm
Hmm.
not a big Dunstan fan, I guess, but I
No.
will I will interject that Dunstan, rumor has it, was said to have grabbed the devil by the nose with his blacksmith's tongs when the devil came to tempt him. And as
Hmm.
a result, Dunstan is the patron saint of blacksmiths, goldsmiths, and locksmiths.
Okay.
And
That's
you
cool. A
reminded me
blacksmith
of it.
saint.
You said something about he was enjoying working,
He did metalworking,
yeah, with
so yeah,
metallurgy.
no, that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Interesting. No, I sometimes feel like if I lived in the Middle Ages, I would have been a monk, just because they're like the
What?
people who you think of them as, oh wow, they're so holy and they were praying all the time and all this kind of stuff, but it really just seems like the place you go when you don't want to be a soldier and you want to read books and
Yeah,
just
that's
hang
true.
out and like grow plants and brew
That's true.
beer. It sounds pretty chill, honestly. If you have to pick, versus going to battle. So anyway, back to Eadred. He uh, it becomes king immediately after his brother is stabbed at Puckle at the feast at Puckle, and Eadred is age 23, which is quite young, and Dunstan becomes a close advisor, and he manages most of the royal treasury and is one of his most trusted counselors throughout his reign.
The
And
other one being his mother, Ed, Edgifu.
Edgifu, and all of the English nobles and bishops swear loyalty to Eadred. If you want to know where, it was at Tanshelf near Pontefract. And this includes the Northumbrians, who, as we had heard last episode and in most of the previous episodes, was not the most stable area in terms of being a part of England. And so, as I just said, a year later, the Northumbrians break their oath and they actually accept the Viking Eric Bloodaxe as their
What a great
king, who had
name,
been
right?
a great name, and he had been king of Norway. I know, I wish we had kept some of the Viking era, I guess Norse last names. You don't hear many, hey, I'm Eric Bloodaxe, I'm an accountant.
I think his father was Harold Thin Hair or Hair Face or something bizarre.
It's funny because almost no one in England at the time had a last name. All these king like Eadred is literally just King Eadred the First. But it's funny that the Norse, I don't know if all of them or just, someone you have to earn it almost, but they actually have last names. So what's interesting is that Eric Bloodaxe, one reason that name might sound sort of familiar is apparently he played a big role in the sagas, in like the Norse sagas. And actually, historians are a little unsure if, obviously, they're sagas, so we're not going to say they're 100% real, but they are definitely based in history. That's essentially where we get most of Norse history is from them. But they're not 100% sure it's the same Eric, but most people agree that it is. And what's interesting is we don't know much in terms of actual history about Eric, but in the sagas, he plays a huge part. He's like one of the main characters, and
It's interesting, like
um,
why, I wonder why someone that wrote the sagas had a thing for Eric, I guess.
my guess is maybe he was a bigger deal in Norway, so we're getting more of that. But then in England, he's not really that important. He's just sort of like a interim kind of
Well,
guy.
because he wasn't king for that long,
Yeah.
because Edred wasn't going to just sit around and let that happen, right?
That is one of my favorite parts of history is if you are able to kind of see both perspectives. Because I sort of did that this for this research. I had been reading about Eadred and it mentions Eric Bloodaxe, and then I was reading about Eric, and obviously it's the same information, but you can kind of tell I'm literally just reading Wikipedia, so it's not like I'm going to some ancient source, but you can even tell the Wikipedia article is written differently and just from a different perspective of how they're writing about everything. But
Hmm.
anyway, you're right. His Eric's father was Harold Fairhair, and he had a younger brother, Hakon the Good. So anyway, Eric is ruling the Northumbrians, who, as we know, have a soft spot for the Vikings. So then the next year in 948, Eadred launches a military campaign into Northumbria and he burns the minster at Ripon, which I assume is a major church. I didn't look too much into it. And he did win, but Eadred's forces sustained heavy losses. It was called the Battle of Castleford. But then, as they're returning south, they end up basically convincing Eric's supporters and army to desert him. And so, pretty quickly, the Northumbrians abandon Eric Bloodaxe, and Eadred is king again of Northumbria. But then this where
Not
it
for
gets a little
long.
bit fuzzy. Basically, then almost immediately after that, another Norse king, Olaf Sithriksson, takes control of Northumbria. But what I had read was it almost seems like Eadred didn't really mind all that much. I think because Olaf Sithriksson had been the godson of Edgar. So I think maybe it was something about he kind of was okay with him ruling, since it almost was going back to that idea that he's almost just the duke or something, or like the
A
earl,
sub king.
the sub king. But it's all that we know really is that Eadred didn't go back up there and fight another battle. That Olaf's rules for a little bit, and then Eric Bloodaxe returns actually and
And I
conquers.
think the Northumbrians invited him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what I
So
read.
what I had read was it definitely gets a lot into northern politics and kind of Viking politics, where it really kind of takes England out of the picture for these couple years up there. It's more them, yeah, fighting against each other. So yeah, I don't know exactly why. I'm assuming Olaf just maybe wasn't a very good ruler. So then, yeah, Eric comes and takes it back over again and has a second reign, which I won't
And
draw
Edred
connections
is not too
to.
happy about that.
Right, he's not happy. So then he does march back up there, and well, actually, no, he isn't killed by Ed Eadred. He's killed. He's betrayed. He gets betrayed by one of his own men.
Yeah,
Um,
Oswulf.
yeah, who kills him. But right immediately after that happens, Northumbria accepts Eadred as their king. And so in 954, that will be the last year that Northumbria is a is not a part of England. So there will never be another time where England loses Northumbria. So you can kind of think of what we think of as England is essentially complete at this point, as
And
far
I
as I
think
can tell.
you mentioned it, but you didn't really emphasize what
Hmm.
I kept reading about when they're talking about these battles is how angry Ed
Oh yeah.
Ed.
Hmm.
Now I'm forgetting our king's
I know
name.
Eadred.
Edred.
Yeah.
Edred was, as you mentioned, he burned a minster when he went there,
Hmm.
and he threatened to burn down all of York.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to me because years later, William the Conqueror will do the act that he regretted on his deathbed, which was basically pillaging and ravishing that area and making it really difficult for anyone to live there for a decade or more. So a
Hmm.
lot of English kings get very upset at the York area of Northumbria.
Hmm. That is interesting to keep in mind. Yeah. And it sort of makes sense that this is seemingly where the line is drawn, where essentially it's as big as they can get. They're never going to really conquer Scotland fully and make it a part of England. So,
Or
some countries
Wales.
just kind of have a maximum size that they can really achieve where they can maintain control of it.
And it's interesting because here we've got this king that's clearly leading battles and doing quite well in them and commands respect, but he is ill, it seems like almost
Hmm.
all the time. He had a digestive disorder, which might be Crohn's disease, just like King Alfred, his grandfather, had, or we think he had. And it seems like his was even worse. And I read that I don't know if this was all the time or just when it flared up, but that he couldn't eat or swallow his food. He just would chew it and spit it out.
I know it's gross to think about. I do feel bad for him, and you're right. If I had to live like that, and also parts of my territory kept getting conquered, I would also probably be pretty upset, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting that it was noted that even compared to other kings and probably the average warrior back then was just more of an angrier person than someone now. But he was, yeah, known to be very angry. At least he was letting his emotions out, He wasn't keeping it
Mm-hmm.
bottled up.
Right.
But before we move on fully from Eric Bloodaxe, I did want to just mention one last thing from the sagas, because he was such a big character. So apparently in the sagas, he's like a larger than life Viking hero, but was ultimately he made flawed and unpopular decisions as a ruler. So it seems like maybe that was one reason he wasn't able to maintain control for a super long time, was he was a great fighter, but maybe not so good at as a ruler, which are not always the same thing.
Nope.
Um, And he was known also to be, he had a violent disposition, cruel, gruff, and taciturn. So a lot of these guys you might not want to, grab a
Hang
beer
out
with.
with.
Yeah.
You don't want to invite him to the frat party at the monastery down the road.
Well, I don't know. Maybe he would be pretty fun at the party, perhaps. But let's see. Another thing besides his digestive illness, which might have been Crohn's disease, who knows? He was a deeply religious king, as we said, a close patron of Saint Dunstan, the saint of blacksmiths, and he supported the monastic reform. And then, is there anything we want to say? Because we're already at 9:55 when his health deteriorates severely, and at age 32, he dies at Frome, which is in Somerset, and he is buried at the Old Minster in Winchester. And the throne will finally pass on to someone who is not a son of Edward the Elder. It will pass on to his nephew, the son of his older brother, the previous King Edmund, and the nephew's name is Eadwig. So we're sticking with the letter E, and we're going on to Eadwig.
So guess what? Edgifu is their
Hmm.
grandmother, so we still get to hear about
Oh my
Edgifu for
God.
2 more episodes.
Man, she won't let go.
She had not letting go, man. It's just amazing that she was so powerful through, I think, 5 kings, if not more, and yet we really don't know anything about her. But
Right.
I will mention that another woman at this king's court, Edred's court, was the widow of his older brother, the former king Athelflaed of Damerham. So she was there as well, which was nice. He let the ladies hang out at court.
He's a
And
feminist.
apparently, she had remarried a powerful ealdorman of East Anglia, and she would have had to have the king's support for that. And then something that's interesting about Edred's, is that how we're saying it?
Ed, Eadred,
I don't
Edred,
know. Eadred, I don't know how
dealer's
so
choice.
with this king that's the topic of our podcast. But he had one of the oldest wills, a king's will, to survive,
Okay.
and he kind of like you might expect, he left a significant wealth to the church because, as you said, he was a big supporter of the church and to other minsters across England. He also left a lot of money and a lot of estates and lands to his mother, Edgifu, and we'll learn a little bit more about that next episode. But she became even more powerful with what he left her in his will. But
Okay.
interestingly, he left funds specifically for the ransoming of captive English people, the slaves. So there were still slaves in this time in Anglo-Saxon England, and he was thinking about them and gave money so they could be ransomed.
Wait, so you're saying he left money for like political prisoners that are kidnapped?
Not political, no, not political prisoners.
Yeah.
Normal people, probably poor people that were enslaved, whether it were people from Wales or, I don't know that much about the slavery at the time. If it was maybe some Anglo-Saxons that had been captured by the Norse in various, raids or whatever. But there were slaves, in addition to having peasants and serfs, there was also the lowest person on the totem pole were enslaved
I know they
people.
definitely had slaves. I just, yeah, but
And
he
he left
left
money
money at his
for,
death to like free slaves, basically?
yes, so that the
Okay.
people that were holding them captive, the earl or whomever that had an Englishman as a captive, would release them because he was paid money through this will to release them.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't know if it goes back to the religion aspect, although I don't think
Yeah.
slavery could have been considered contrary to God's will that strongly if it was, an accepted practice at the time. So I think
I
it
don't
just
know.
paints
I
this.
From what I understand, I think there was like a distinction where like the Vikings and other people actively had slaves, but I feel like the average English person would have at least pretended that they were like an indentured servant or something. Like
That could be.
I'm
I'm
not
not really
100% sure,
sure.
but I do feel like Christians, I think we like to think that, it was like, well, they were just a product of their time. But I think for a lot of this stuff, there was like strong disagreement. But some people just didn't care because they wanted
But I
what they
do think
wanted.
it's really unusual and cool
No, yeah,
that
definitely.
he would think of something like that specifically to denote in his will.
That makes me want to look more into if he was doing stuff like that while he was alive, if he was kind of like
Hmm. Hmm.
freeing. I'll look
And
into it and I'll say next
some
episode.
points that I read about him were, he, as you said, he extinguished the last Viking kingdom in what we now know as England. He was able to maintain a unified kingdom despite there being pressures. As you said, he supported the monastic reform, and he left the stage for what will soon become somewhat of a golden age. Not immediately, but in the future. So even though he was very sickly and he never married and he died when he was in his early
No air.
30s, he did a lot.
He did a lot. And I will give a little bit of a teaser, just like you did for the next episode, but because it kind of pays off what I was saying about Dunstan. So not only was he a really influential and probably not very fun to hang out with monk, he has a big falling out with the new, who will become the new king, Edwig. I'll say why, because it seems like a pretty funny moment. Apparently, he dragged King Edwig away from a private celebration with a noblewoman. So you can
Mm.
kind of put
Hmm.
together maybe what was going on there. Dragged him to his own coronation feast, humiliating him publicly. So King Eadred banishes Dunstan, and I forget where he goes, but he goes to actually Ghent in the Netherlands. And well, I don't want to get too much into it, but I'll just say he goes to Ghent and he will return to England, and that's what we'll find out next episode.
I guess I'll
What?
try to do my Adela moment. It's a
Okay.
little complicated, and I'll just very
All right, yeah,
quickly
make it as
summarize.
succinct as possible. The Adela
Succinctly
moment.
as As succinctly as possible, Adela married into the Thebodian family, who, when she was alive, ruled the Champagne region and also the Loire Valley, Chartres and Blois area. And the Count of Blois at that time was Thebode. So remember Athelstan's sisters and Edred's sisters that were married to Otto the Great and King Charles the
Mm-hmm.
Simple and Hugh the Great.
Mm-hmm.
They were having a big fight. And remember how Edward and Edmund grew up with King, who would ultimately become King Louis IV of France when they were little kids?
Right.
They were all together. Well, that's because Louis's father, Charles the Simple, had been deposed, and his mom took him to Athelstan's court for protection because Athelstan was her half brother, and
Okay.
that's why Louis grew up there. But then,
Right.
when he was a little bit older, his brother-in-law, who was married to another of his half sisters, Hugh the Great, called him back and basically had him crowned king of France instead of Hugh taking over the throne, which he could have done. But then I guess he felt like Louis got a little bit too big for his britches because Hugh's idea was that he would still control, but just Louis was going to be a figurehead. And Louis didn't like that so much as he grew older. So he was
Okay.
ultimately kidnapped and held prisoner for quite a while. And during that time, Adela's, I think it was the father of her father in law, held King Louis captive. So that's my little connection. It's a
Okay.
little, it's a little strained,
A little.
but it lets you know about what happened with Louis
It
and
is a pretty strong
ultimately,
connection, yeah. Because
yeah,
William, when I learned about him, I had never quite realized how connected he already was. Even though he is invading and bringing this French culture in, it is a big shift. There is a reason why he felt some amount of right to be the King of England. And
right.
England and France are going to have a very, very odd relationship until
For
the
many,
end of
many years to
time.
come.
Yeah. One last thing I had finally looked into from last week, I kept mentioning the five boroughs. They were similar to Strathclyde and Northumbria, these regions that we keep talking about that were hard to hold on to and that were primarily Viking influenced. So, just to clarify, the five boroughs were part of the Danelaw, and they were the five main towns of Danish Mercia. So,
Oh,
basically, the part of Mercia that was Danish was called the five boroughs. So, it's not
so
New York State,
probably
not
the
those five
eastern
boroughs.
part of Mercia.
Yeah, it's now known as the East Midlands. So, yeah.
Cool.
I guess one last thing, you were talking about how he left a bunch of money. It did seem like he was very protective of his treasure. He kept enormous amounts of wealth in personal, like strong boxes, like safes, basically. And he trusted almost nobody with his finances except Saint Dunstan, which kind of makes sense. You kind of think of Saint Dunstan as, like we said, maybe dour, but is gonna
He's
do
not
the
going to
right
spend all
thing.
the money, that's for
He's not
sure.
gonna, yeah, he's not gonna sin.
Yeah, I think he sent for it at his deathbed, though, right? He sent for Dunstan to go bring him his treasure.
Yeah, and but basically, I almost wonder if Eadred, being, as I said, like the youngest, who's growing up during all this other history we've talked about the last couple episodes, he would have known about all this stuff and everything that had happened. So you're sort of probably pretty paranoid about maintaining control. So,
Hmm.
your grandpa, Alfred, had like a little swamp that was his whole land, and now it's England. So you don't feel that very confident that you're going to be able to hold on to all this. So it makes sense that you would be a bit of a hoarder and
Hmm.
have a some money stashed away for a rainy day.
Yeah, because if you're the first king to really rule for the most part, a united England, then that means that this is all very fresh. And so
Hmm.
there's possible people trying to grab their land back all over the place. You have to be, and you need money in order to defeat them, to hire
Hmm.
mercenaries and to have people follow you because you can pay them. So,
Right. All right. Well, I would say for a king that almost no one on earth has ever heard of and gets very little
and I
mention
can't seem
in
to
any
remember
books.
his name even
I
during the
can't even
podcast.
remember his name, but he was a pretty interesting guy,
He
A lot,
was.
a lot was still going on, a lot to talk about, and I think the same will be true next week with his nephew Eadwig, which is also a strange name that we will probably
It
forget.
is, and I don't think I'm going to like him, but I do like Edred. So there you
Okay.
go.
I'd say overall, these last couple, we've been getting a little spoiled, where it feels like they did a pretty decent job. We haven't got
Well,
to a
there
real
weren't a lot of women for
deeper.
me to talk about, but at least
Not
we
a lot of
got
women.
Ed
Well,
Giff.
except old Ed Gifu. She's still there. It's I got to be honest though. I mean, we barely even have anyone to talk about. It's funny because it'd almost be like if in a couple thousand years all they knew about 2026 was like who's the president. Like which would give them some window into things, but we don't really know anything about all these other things. There could be so much going on in England that we don't know about, but you're right that one thing we very know almost nothing about is all 50% of the population, women.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
the people that birthed all of the population. So,
And before we wrap things up, I wanted to say that you can also I'm going to start uploading our videos onto YouTube. So if you'd like to watch us instead of just listening to us, you can catch us on YouTube, where you will see that I've been wearing chainmail this entire episode. I hope you weren't hearing it jingling during the recording. And follow us on Instagram at RainCheckPod, REIGN podcast.
check.
Wait, RainCheckPod, pardon me. I think that's going to call it for today.
Thank you so much. Look forward to talking next week.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.